It's interesting to note, Mr. Speaker, that it was 50 years ago this year that Brenda May Robertson was elected to the Legislative Assembly right here in the province of New Brunswick, representing the District of Albert. That shows how progressive this party was in voting the first and having the first female minister here in the province of New Brunswick. I had coffee with the senator now, retired senator, before Christmas, and she's still interested in the politics and the going on of the political outcomes here in the province of New Brunswick, hoping for the best for the province. So, Mr. Speaker, la prochaine élection, c'est très proche. The next provincial election is coming up in only 19 months. And this goes by very quickly in politics. We are faced with a government who is willing to throw money around like crazy in order to try and buy the favor of the voters to remain in power. It will be interesting to watch as they attempt to overcome the pain they've caused the people who've had to reach deeper and deeper and deeper into their pockets and take $500 million per year of new tax money out of their pockets to sustain the spending spree of this Gallant government. We need to get back to good, fair policies for the people of New Brunswick. And the PC leader from Quispam-Sisk is the one who's going to get this province back. You know, sometimes I just stop and think what could have been if the Liberals had not won those 3 or 4 additional seats by a total of only about 500 votes combined. There'd be no HST increase. The good people of New Brunswick would not be facing some type of a carbon tax into the future that's going to take more money out of their pockets, possibly. Our seniors would not be worried about what's next, and is the government going to go after our assets again? And the students would have a fairer, more equitable tuition program. There would be a tremendous opportunity for the natural gas and oil industry to be developing in this province. But most of all, the budget would be balanced this year, Mr. Speaker. That's what I was trying to say. Budgets don't balance themselves. That's right. You have to work at it. You have to work hard at doing that. You know, Mr. Speaker, we've been told that raising HST is the lazy way of getting things done. I remember that. It was recorded on tape. It was replayed many, many times on tape, so I guess it did happen. Mr. Speaker, that's what we've seen here today, is this government taking the lazy way out in increasing taxes, and instead of putting that on the debt or deficit, they've just spent that money in order to gain favor with the people here in the province of New Brunswick in participation for the next election. Je ne suis pas la seule personne qui trouve le budget malheureux. But, you know, Mr. Speaker, what's happened here is that the Liberals have really driven home their philosophy of tax and spend in the last few years. Increasing taxes so much to the tune of $500 million, and they've increased almost every tax known to the New Brunswickers. And now they're making up taxes. They're going to make up a carbon tax. We have yet to see the details on that. And there's even talk of a sugar tax. And I know the minister yesterday said there's no new taxes. But we heard yesterday about the changes they've made in the way taxes are applied to trailer parks and owners of the trailers themselves. So the minister gets up and says one thing, but the reality on the street, something different has happened. When they say no new tax, so quickly after raising the HST, when they say no new tax, yet they're going after the campground owners and the campers. Part of tourism that's very, very important in this province of New Brunswick. We have a short summer season, and now people are going to have to be spending more money in order to enjoy the pastimes that they have in the summer. So let's review. Examination cela de près. There were 2 taxes that were put forward in the Liberal platform to deal with the deficit. A $30 million income tax on those making more than $150,000 per year, and a $30 million property tax increase on businesses. They were quickly imposed, but generally only a fraction of the money the Liberal 2014 platform realistically needed. To compensate, the Liberals raised the gas tax, $18 million. They raised the diesel tax for $10 million. They raised the tobacco tax, $50 million. But even that wasn't enough to satisfy the spending needs of this government. They also raised corporate income tax, $34 million. Property transfer tax, $10 million. Tax on banks, $3 million. And they raised the provincial portion of the HST to take $300 million out of the pockets of the hardworking people of the province of New Brunswick. To generate even more revenue, the Liberals eliminated tuition tax credits for university and college students, which resulted in about $32 million windfall. They imposed a number of fee increases on things like vehicles, land registration, to the tune of $7 million. And instead of two tax increases totaling $60 million to fund the election platform, the Gallant government instead imposed 10 different taxes, and when added up, the fee increases to take in more than $500 million, $500 million. Shame. Now look, Mr. Speaker, I know and you know that we do need revenue to run the province of New Brunswick. We need to run a good health care system. We need to run a good senior care system. We need to run the education system. We need to make sure the roads are plowed and maintained. And Mr. Speaker, we know that doctors and nurses and the support staff that support the teachers need to be paid. But with the Gallant government spending growth approaching 5% per year, some of the restraints seem to be lacking. And Mr. Speaker, we are real concerned for the sustainability that is in question here for the province of New Brunswick in those departments. Let's talk a bit about the carbon tax and what may be in line for the future. I did find it very interesting that it was mentioned in the budget speech, but the message we heard was something a little cloudy, a lot of smoke between what's going to happen and where we are now. We heard something like, we know we're going to go into the pockets of the people again and take some money, more money out of your hard-earned money. We just don't know how or how much. But no worries, whatever we take, we're going to spend somewhere and call it revenue neutral. Now, it's the Liberal definition of revenue neutral, or I should say the Gallant government definition of revenue neutral, and not at all what the rest of the world thinks for a definition. So you might call this a made in New Brunswick idea. See, the rest of the world, revenue neutral means that you lower one type of tax as another is added, so that the taxpayers end up at the same position financially after the tax. But in the New Brunswick Gallant government, they will take the money and then spend it where they see fit. Now, the claim made in the minister's speech that a carbon tax will reduce emission is a claim that the minister will have to prove, because we've already seen increase in the taxes on fuel, oil, and gasoline, but there has been no corresponding reduction in the use of vehicles or a reduction in the emissions here in the province of New Brunswick. So, the actions on this particular file by the Gallant government have been just awful. Les actions du gouvernement Gallant concernant le dossier sont très malheureuses. First, there was an all-party committee that was struck. Now, it appeared to be that it was going in the right direction, unlike the Electoral Reform Committee, where the report was written, put on the desk, and then we were asked to join in on it. But anyways, they asked the members of the committee, which included all three parties, to do public sessions before the report was written. This is where things seem to slip just a bit, because the chair of the committee stated publicly before everyone was heard and the report was written that we need a pool of money. Now, that was before the final report, even in draft, was written. And it was at this point that the skeptical New Brunswick started to believe this whole exercise was just another strategic program review charade, which wasted a lot of time and money and energy and effort of the people in the province of New Brunswick to arrive at a predetermined outcome, which was more taxes and more money for the government to spend where they saw fit. But perhaps the biggest disappointment on the carbon tax file was when Prime Minister Trudeau proclaimed we are going to impose a price on carbon to the provinces. Now, that was exactly at the same time his federal minister of environment was at the federal provincial environment ministers meeting, and they were supposed to have sincere and open discussions. But what was telling for me was the reaction of the various provinces. Nova Scotia walked out on the meetings. Premier Brad Wall said, no way. Premier from BC said, well, if we're going to do that, we need to get something out of it. But our Premier and our Minister, they gave no second thought to the citizens of New Brunswick and said, yes, sir, Mr. Trudeau, whatever you say. So before our committee work was done, before the meetings were over, the Premier was putting his hands on more than New Brunswickers' hard-earned money. And that's not the first time that's happened, Mr. Speaker. There seems to be a trend evolving here. Let's talk about some of the different views on the health care accord. The 10 provinces, the premiers and the ministers of health in the 10 provinces, they had a plan. They had a strategy. And they were unified against the federal government. They had meetings and everyone was there at the table, including the feds and the provinces, the sous-ministres, the deputies, and all the provincial health ministers and their deputies for both sides, ready to have some really, really tough but fair negotiations. So the feds pushed back. What happened at the first sign of pushback? Well, our Premier, once again, gives no thought or concern to the well-being of the people in the province of New Brunswick. Notre Premier ministre, encore une fois, n'accorde pas une seule pensée pour le bien-être de la gens du Nouveau-Brunswick. He breaks ranks, scuttles the plan and the solidarity of the provinces, cuts and run. Maybe he got the order from Dominic Leblanc. And as our leader has put it, the Premier was just handed a script and he read it verbatim. See, of course, the criticism came very, very quickly from the other provinces. But once the ranks were broken, once the end run was done by our Premier, they felt they had no choice but to follow suit. How much money was left on the table? Well, it was probably substantial. Money in healthcare goes quickly, and a 10-year deal is a very, very long time in healthcare. So I hope our people in the province of New Brunswick are not on the short end of the stick because the Premier caved and didn't end run on his counterparts. In the budget speech, the minister tried to frame this as leadership. Dans le discours de budget, les actes de le Premier ministre ont été, but the rest of Canada sees the Premier's actions for what they are, an act of betrayal, and that betrayal by Premier Gallant will come back to haunt us in the future, right when we need it the most, possibly on the Energy East pipeline, a file again that has gone south under the leadership of this Premier. You know, he should be pressing the Prime Minister to say he will support the findings of the NEB. If the NEB, National Energy Board, finds the pipeline should go ahead, the Prime Minister should say right now that he will support that. And you know, Mr. Speaker, he approved the pipeline at Kinder Morgan in BC. But you know, you look at the dynamics of that. That was a pipeline that already was sited. It was just a twinning of another pipeline, and a lot of the work had been done. This pipeline, which is going to go through the Prime Minister's backyard in Montreal, in Quebec, is going to meet a greater resistance than it did in BC. But I think if the Premier would push the Prime Minister to take a stand, don't sit on the fence, but take a stand that's going to support and help the Energy East pipeline to move oil here to the province of New Brunswick, move it to Tidewater, and again, an opportunity for the people here in the province. Getting back to the health care, it is one of the biggest financial commitments the province has. Although the interest on the debt, as it surpassed $700 million, is moving up the ladder. But the budget for health care is one of the most difficult to manage, and it's a huge issue as we look to the future to make sure it's sustainable. Again, the question has to be asked, is the money going to be invested in the right place? And I say that because of this letter that I received just the other day from one of the residents in my riding, and it was also copied to the Minister of Health. and I'm writing you to express my dissatisfaction with the wait time for elective orthopedic surgery at the 2 hospitals in the City of Moncton. I am on the wait list for joint replacement surgery, and according to my surgeon and the New Brunswick Government Surgical Wait Time website, the wait time for orthopedic surgeries at the 2 hospitals in Moncton are now 1.5 to 2 years. That is too long to wait, considering the national benchmark is supposed to be 6 months. It is my understanding that the 6-month benchmark is an effective, evidence-based goal that each province or territory strives to meet, while balancing other priorities aimed at providing quality health care to Canadians. More importantly, for patients like me, the 6-month benchmark is the amount of time that clinical evidence has shown is appropriate to wait for a procedure. I am concerned that waiting double or triple that time will be detrimental to my quality of life and my health. My surgeon tells me he would operate on me sooner if he could, but he is not able to get the operating room time or hospital beds required to perform surgeries within the benchmark time. I respectfully ask you, as my MLA and the Minister of Health, the Honourable Victor Boudreau, what do you intend to do to address this issue? And respectfully, a member from residents from Riverview. So that goes back to the question, just throwing money at the healthcare budget, it has to be managed in the proper way and make sure what needs to be done is done in a prudent manner. And I want to thank the former health minister on this side of the legislature, the member from Edmundston, and also the member from Rothesay. The member from Rothesay did a great job in managing the health care budget and yet not affecting critical frontline services. Thank you very much for that. And of course, staying with healthcare, on top of many people's minds these days is the privatizing of cleaning and food services. Now, our government examined that, yes, but we shelved that idea. The Gallant government has rethermalized that and resurrected it, and we should ask the question why. Because really it's all about what's doing best for New Brunswickers. It is about the cleanliness of the hospital. It is about better food. I don't think that this government sees anything more than the $8 million they tend to take and spend elsewhere. Because the CEO of Vitality Health Network said last week that the authority has been told that the Sodexo agreement is coming, despite a unanimous vote by the Vitality Board last summer that it should continue running its own service, its own food service, its own cleaning service itself. And they have said that they can find the savings themselves, and they have a plan to do it. But this government has made decisions that affect the decisions of the board. It makes you wonder, you know, why are they have the boards there in the first place if they're just going to overrule them all the time? So, Mr. Speaker, we on this side know that healthcare is so important, but we have to make sure that it is sustainable in the years to come, because we are getting older. We have an old generation, and it's getting older. I know I'm the oldest I'm getting older every day, and it's getting worse. I'm the oldest I've ever been, and it's getting worse every day. But, Mr. Speaker, we on this side know how important sustainability in healthcare is in the province of New Brunswick, and we're committed to that for sure. Let's talk a little bit about the claim that the Finance Minister made about education being more accessible and more affordable. Mr. Speaker, I do find that statement quite the most obnoxious and least factual statement the Minister made. Well, if it's not the most, it's certainly the top three, and allow me to explain why. See, we on this side understand the need for universities to have long-term plans for funding, and it helps them plan, it helps them manage their costs. And we had a long-term funding arrangement for them as well. And it's good that the universities have agreed to come and appear annually before the Legislative Assembly. That's what was stated in the budget, and I thought maybe it would just be a committee, but the Minister said it would be for the Legislative Assembly, so we will expect to see the universities in front of the 49 MLAs. Now, it is an additional $49 million total over 4 years, which is $11.25 million per year, divided by the 4 universities. So it's actually 2.8 years. So I guess when you break it down, it's not as big a number as the government tries to promote and portray. 2.8 million certainly doesn't go as far as it used to when I went to Mount Allison University. But the fact of the matter is we want to make sure that those funds go in a fair and equitable manner to the 4 universities. But the point that I find so obnoxious is that they could have made their tuition access bursary program fairer and more inclusive because they had the money. It's obviously they had the money in that budget, as we've seen here today. They could have stopped the discrimination against the students who could qualify for the program and let the students make the choice of what institution that they wanted to attend. Mr. Speaker, the government could have changed the hard line of a $60,000 family income into a sliding scale or stack the benefits on a per-child or per-student benefit, but they chose not to. They could have made it fair, they could have made education more accessible, and they could have made it more affordable, but they have done neither in those areas. Mr. Speaker, they've made it harder for students to access post-secondary education because they've taken away a choice. They've made it less affordable because there's some students that aren't able to go back because of their situation and where they find themselves. So I do wonder, Mr. Speaker, what the Premier or what the Minister would say to a parent that I was talking to, and their student was entering the 3rd year of their degree, and they had to withdraw from school and get a job to start saving again for university because the funds had been expended and the cash flow from the education tax credit had vanished overnight due to a poorly thought out policy. So more accessible, more affordable, not for that family. There had been no means test, no sliding scale. There could have been an option for that individual. Now, of course, if it was the Premier that was talking to those people, he'd have to go out and actually go face-to-face with people, something it has tried to avoid lately, instead only appearing at photo ops to take a few selfies or quick, strictly controlled events, 20 seconds to mash the potatoes, take the picture, post it, and we're off to the next adventure. And I wonder also what the Premier or the Finance Minister would say to the former employer. This is the former employer of the Finance Minister today, Crandall University, who have been excluded from the tuition access bursary again because they are considered not a public university but a private university. Well, Mr. Speaker, I've talked to the President out there, and they have actually lost students. Their enrollment is actually decreased because many students have said, if I can get this program at another university on the government's tab, why should I be here paying my own way? Right. Mr. Speaker, this is an interesting point because when a student goes to a publicly funded university, the government has to ante up twice because they're paying the university to provide the services, and now they're paying the student to go and take those courses. An institution like Crandall University, the government doesn't subsidize, and now they're not subsidizing the students. So for the Finance Minister, who used to work at that college, to not stand up and protect the interests of that university, Mr. Speaker, I think it's deplorable. And to stand here in the House and say, I have made education more accessible and more affordable is total and downright opposite to what the real facts are out there. There was a chance for the minister to correct the flaw that was actually stated by the minister from Hamilton-Restigouche, but wasn't fixed. So the flaw is there. They had an opportunity to fix it in this budget. They could have included places such as Olton's College, Eastern College, Mackenzie College, Bethel College, Crandall University, but they are all discriminated against by this government and this minister on this. There's also, I heard about a welding shop in southwestern part of the province that had 15 students. And in that area, the community college had 15 students. Well, with this discriminatory policy, the students that were going to go to that private sector training center has dried up. And there's now a waiting list at MBCC. So the people who have chosen now to wait, they do not have accessible education. Mr. Speaker, I understand that the colleges have binded together and hired a reputable lawyer, former Attorney General, some of you may know him, former Minister of Health, and a Queen's Counsel as well. Many of you know the name Mike Murphy? Yeah. Well, if I was a betting man, so they've hired Mike to sue the government for this discriminatory policy. Now, if I was a betting man, my money's on Mike. Now, Mr. Speaker, we've seen a bit of juggling of some money here, and we go back in history and look at some of the takeaways, and then we're looking at it being put back in here today. Think about the foresters and the woodlot owners. They can't be blamed if they don't cheer too loudly for the $2 million spruce budworm protection, because it was this Liberal government that actually cut silviculture by more than that amount over the last couple of years. And Mr. Speaker, we know that the forests are one of our biggest assets in this province, and they need to be protected. Les forêts sont une des plus grandes autour de notre province et elles devront être protégées. You know, Mr. Speaker, a good silviculture program also leads to a healthy forest, and that's important as well, because a healthy forest can help stave off budworm infestation. And actually, the forest sector was one of the sectors that was so positive here in the province of New Brunswick, because we came up with a forest plan. And obviously, that forestry plan has had some positive results here in the province of New Brunswick, as talked about in the GDP of 2015. Now, the finance minister was making a lot of noise about increasing funding for tourism, which has been added to the list of top priorities by the Gallant government. Now, this percentage is a big percentage. The dollar amount isn't as big as some of the other departments, but I certainly hope it doesn't just end up in some Liberal-friendly ad agency. We've seen M5 receive a huge tourism contract already, and it's troubling because M5 website boasts of the work it did on the Liberal 2014 election campaign. So I hope that this new money in tourism doesn't go as a payoff for services already rendered or an advance on volunteer work for the next election. And it's interesting when you talk about percentage increases, there was actually no mention at all of the big percentage increase to our First Nations via the tax deal. That's another $7 million, an increase that is a double-digit percentage but was not mentioned at all. So did they mean to admit this number because it shows they did not address the inequities in the First Nations communities? Or did they not want to highlight the fact that this risk to the retail private sector is something that this government does not want to tackle at all? We've asked some questions as to when this is going to be addressed, and we haven't received an answer. So the fact that there's just additional money thrown at this looks to see that this government has just kicked that issue down the road and does not want to address it. And that is troubling. Another very troubling fact, Mr. Speaker, is yesterday we learned that New Brunswick is the only province to have a drop in population. The population growth file has been another so-called priority, and it has certainly enjoyed a very high visibility over the last couple of years. But we are the only province to see our population decline over the last 5 years. Now, this should be a screaming indication that something has gone terribly wrong. We actually lost 1,000 last year alone when this Gallant government was making the decisions for the people of the province of New Brunswick. Now, it's likely the taxpayers finally had had enough of living in the highest tax jurisdiction in North America, and it's not getting better. We are aging, as I talked before. We have an aging population. We need to make sure that any newcomers have the proper resources to help people. We need to help them make the decision to stay in New Brunswick. But we also need to make sure that our existing residents have a reason to stay. They have a reason to stay. Mr. Speaker, that comes down a lot to the topic of jobs. We've said all along that we know you can't tax your way to prosperity. And we also know you need to consider every opportunity that comes your way to create long-term sustainable jobs. Mr. Speaker, the Liberal government has shut the door on natural gas development, and they've missed a huge opportunity. Due to this politically motivated policy that has driven investment, it's driven jobs, and it's driven people out of the province of New Brunswick. So we can look specifically at the increased taxes and the missed job opportunities, policies that this government has put forward that is actually driving that population decrease here in the province of New Brunswick, and it's got to be stopped. Mr. Speaker, the economic outlook released at the same time as the budget indicates that the government has lost jobs, lots of jobs. But the Premier and the Finance Minister remain purposely oblivious. They certainly cherry-pick their facts and cherry-pick the time frame that they want to highlight. And, you know, if we believe them, we'd think everything is just rosy, but we know that's not the fact at all. Net jobs is the measurement. Net jobs was the measurement when they were in opposition. Net jobs will continue to be the measurement while we are in opposition and they are in government. But now, don't get me wrong. I know there's many people at ONB that are working hard trying to bring jobs here. And we know that absolutely certain there have been some jobs created by this government. We can't forget the cigarette police. That was an initiative started by this job. You remember the cigarette squad? It was the buddies of the Deputy Premier, the in-law of the Treasury Board President, among others. And let's talk about this a minute, because it was interesting to see in the budget. Those jobs were supposed to go to competition. It said so in the Liberal platform. And if we believe that document, you know, these jobs were not advertised, which was breaking another election promise. Les employés n'ont pas été annoncés, brisant une autre promesse électorale. But anyways, let me get to the real point I was trying to make that was found in the government guesstimates or estimates. In this case, maybe it's wishtimates. But look at the figures under the fines and penalties for the Tobacco Sales Acts. In 2016-2017, the estimate was $2.5 million, $2,512,000. 2016-17, you can look it up in your books, it was revised to $3,000. 2017-28, it was projected at $3,000. Now, Mr. Speaker, what was the annual budget for the cigarette squad? I think it was $3 million, maybe a little more, maybe a little less. But one thing is for sure, it was more than $3,000. Now, you remember the spin, the hype when the government announced this? They were throwing numbers around like $13 million saved annually, $5 million of increased taxes through the efforts of the cigarette squad. And actually, the press release is still up on the government website for anyone who cares to look at it, though there may be some people scrambling right now to take that down. But the press release on the government website said certainly that the $3,000 in the estimate is certainly more than the 2.5 that was estimated the year before. So we're wondering what happened there and why those numbers are so far off. Maybe they were sampling some of the Organogram product. I don't know. Speaking of Organogram, it's one of the few decisions that I'd like to highlight. And again, it goes back to who's making the decisions or how the thought pattern is going by the decisions made in cabinet. Remember, many of the same people are the ones who were responsible for the ATCON fiasco and the failed attempt to sell MB Power. Oh yeah, speaking of MB Power sale, there was another job that was created, and that's the position of issue management in St. John. We'll talk about that a little bit more. that's when the Premier hired the former Sean Graham minister, who was responsible for B&B at the time of the AdCon fiasco, and who was the head as they tried to sell MB Power to Quebec. But the member from Sudbury, New Maryland, had a great commentary published in media. You can check it out on Facebook. I have a copy here. If you'd like, a couple of the highlights that were very good. When the Premier boasts about taking a pay cut, he continues to waste your hard-earned tax dollars on political appointments with salaries more than double what the average New Brunswicker is talking about. Mr. Keir, a member of the AdCon cabinet and Minister of Business New Brunswick at the time of the $70 million given against the advice of the experts in the department. So, and then how can we forget Mr. Keir's biggest claim to fame, the failed sale of MB Power, an agreement written on the back of the napkin. And I remember when I was interim leader, I ran into Mr. Keir in the basement of this building, and I asked the question to the Premier, what's going on? We had heard that Sean Graham was at the Mactaquac Dam, and we see Mr. Keir downstairs in the legislature. I made a reference to Star Wars, which the Premier took great offense to, but now that they're remaking subsequent episodes, maybe that would hit home a little bit more. But Mr. Speaker, we've seen now that the Premier is reassembling the crowd, the Sean Graham bunch, who's again made some terrible decisions and had that same tax and spend Liberal government. So we can see where some of these ideas are coming from. But, Mr. Speaker, it's not just myself or the opposition that talks about that way. We can't forget how the Auditor General described the actions of the AdCon cabinet. And the Auditor General said, in my opinion, Cabinet displayed a very troubling disregard for taxpayers' money. So we see a trend happening here. They still have a very troubling disregard for taxpayers' money, and they still have a very troubling disregard for the facts, accuracy, and reality. But just back to Organigram for a minute. I was watching the show Taking Stock. It's one of my favorite. It's on one of the business channels. And a few weeks ago, the CEO of Organigram, Dennis Arsenault, was being interviewed. And he stated that his company, Organigram, had $65 million in cash on their balance sheet. $65 million. Now, this was the company that the Premier invested $1 million of the taxpayers' money into. Now, I heard that the dope business has done very well without government help over the last couple of decades, if not longer. So why would you have to put taxpayers' money into a company when they can go to the private sector and raise almost $120 million, and they have about $65 million of that sitting on their balance sheet in cash? Well, I'll tell you why this government did that. Because they want to take credit for the jobs. They just want to say, we've made a rash promise here during the campaign, and we need to try and justify how and why we made that promise. So let's try and grasp every little job that we can and take credit for that. Interesting development, and look, I wish Organigram the best. They are a company that is traded on the stock market, but they've had a product recall announced December 30th that includes having to bring back some product because it was exposed to some types of chemical. And I know my colleague from Fredericton North has done a great commentary about some of the decisions that have been made at Opportunities New Brunswick, and I would suggest everyone talk about that. And one of the comments that the member made was with respect to the annual report. Sometimes you see so many announcements that with such fanfare and balloons and noisemakers. I'm reminded about the BMM Test Labs announcement during the federal campaign, where the Premier and ministers and everybody was brought to the Capitol Theatre in Moncton, and there was the announcement of 1,000 jobs. 1,000 jobs, and that was the headline. The fact of the matter is, when you look down at the fine print, it wasn't 1,000 jobs today. In fact, it wasn't any jobs in that year. It was later on in 2016. And we see that due the questioning from my member from North York, trying to get the information out of how many of those jobs had been filled. And the CEO of Opportunities in Brunswick was very reluctant to give any of that information during public accounts. But I would suggest you look at the commentary, because when the annual report was released, the question was asked, why no grand unveiling of this report? No all-hands-on-deck celebratory gathering of the Premier and his ministers, not even a media scrum. So again, it goes back to the point that maybe they were ashamed of some of the antics that had occurred during the federal campaign in boasting an outcome that they knew would never be completed, certainly not within their mandate. And again, when it goes back to making decisions on where the money is spent, that's some of the things that we want to question. And we've seen certainly money spent on a campaign ad right across the country, in the airports, on billboards, that we suggest has some misleading or inaccurate information. And again, that maybe goes back to the mantra of this government, where it's all style and no substance. The sign says that the economy is soaring and that there are 3,000 jobs at NB Jobs. Now, based on a further fact-checking, the economy is actually expected to be lower longer, and the website that had that many jobs, some of them were counted twice, duplicated, and it was quickly changed to read 1,200 jobs before someone gave the order to change it back to what it was, because it makes us look bad. And over the Christmas holidays, New Brunswickers could not switch on their televisions without being bombarded by taxpayer-funded ads telling us what a great job the Gallant government was doing. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that the fact of the matter is something different than the claims made on that television commercial. So we have sent an RTI to find out just what the cost was and who put that together. And actually, you know, another interesting item that came to mind the other day. You know, I'm sure we've all shopped here at Sears, and we want to see it succeed. But we remember stores like Eaton, retail stores that have fallen by the wayside, and they certainly don't compete well with newcomers like Walmart, Costco, Amazon, an e-commerce store that has a wide variety of products, and you know, retail is a dog-eat-dog business, and Sears has been bitten. And I hope this government doesn't get chewed as well, because now they've put some money into that company as well. They've tried to claim that there's no risk, but you know, we've heard that story before, Mr. Speaker. Part of this assistance is a form of a loan from ONB and money from RDC. So if there's no risk, why do you call it a loan? Because most people expect to get the money back from a loan. But yet we've seen a history of this government, at least the same members who were in cabinet under Sean Graham and in cabinet with the Gallant government, give loans that haven't gone well at all. And I was on the MSN website, Money website, talking about Sears, and certainly the value of the company has gone through some tremendous changes in the last number of years, and there's been a significant amount of angst in the stock. I mean, the 2016 fiscal year on this website, it said it ended, Sears had lost $1.1 billion on revenue of $25.1 billion. On January 30th, the stock fell 13% to a value of $640 million for the company. That's 71% below what it was in 2016. So again, in my former life as a stockbroker, I certainly wouldn't be recommending that as a company to invest in at this point in time. But you know, there's some other. This government is so addicted to spending money that they're looking for just about any project to throw money at, and projects that we may have looked at and said it's not viable, or even when I look at the snowmaking machine at Sugarloaf, well, that was a project that even Sean Graham would not fund. And now we see this government competing with our 3 private-run ski hills here in the province of New Brunswick. And you know, Mr. Speaker, in my riding, we have a new bridge on the Petitcodiac River. and it's interesting response. Of course, there's some folks that say that is the greatest project ever built, and I understand the importance of restoring the river. I've also had some people very, very adamantly say that it's a total waste of money. And if there was that kind of money to spend, then it should be spent on healthcare, should be spent on seniors, should be spent on housing and education. The whole conversation started with Fish Passage in the river. The Fish Passage has been accomplished with the opening of the gates. But now the last word from DTI, they're going to put a new bridge in there. And actually the concern that I have now at this point in time is that the route will be blocked for 4 to 6 months. It's not just the inconvenience that the folks are going to be faced with, because there have been other areas that have had bridges closed, even here in Fredericton. But I see it as a safety issue. If an accident occurs on the one remaining bridge, then emergency services will be compromised for a significant number of people in Riverview and in Albert County. And I know here in Fredericton there was another access point, but it had great entrance and egress, a lot easier flow of traffic at that time. Where in Riverview, the lanes have to cross at the Gunningsville Bridge. And again, if there was an accident on that bridge, the safety access to the emergency rooms would be cut off. But anyways, that's going forward, and the members at DTI had an open house, and they seem to have their minds made up. Although in talking to the engineers, they said if we were directed and money was not an issue, we would be able to accommodate that. Or it seemed to be money's not the issue, we just don't want to do it that way. Anyways, let's talk about the effect that some of these projects are going to have on the net debt for a little while. And it's interesting that some of the commentaries on the stories about net debt increasing over the last years. I know I was, as I mentioned, a former financial planner. I'm concerned about the fact the province has not balanced its budget for 8 years and counting. And as a financial planner, an individual who is going in debt year after year after year is only heading in one direction, and that's bankruptcy unless they make some hard decisions to turn that around. And anyways, but there was a commentary and a note made about when Premier Allward was there and when Premier Gallant was there, or Graham was there, and how the net debt has increased. So I'd just like to talk about that a little bit, if I could. When a project's completed, it used to be that, well, nowadays it has to be booked when it's completed, booked on the according to the accounting rules when it's completed. Now, one of the nice points about being a long-term serving MLA is you remember what happened years ago. And it used to be, under Bernard Lord's day, capital projects had to be booked within the year that they were started. And now they're booked in the year that they're completed. And the discussion, I remember, was raised that, well, what if a government ramped up the capital expenditures in an election year or created multi-year projects so that the next government would have to deal with those new accounting ripples. I called it the poison pill, because when David Allward was elected, we had to take over from the Sean Graham government a number of poison pills. And there were some big poison pills, Mr. Speaker. There was the hospital up north, and there was Route 1. It totaled roughly $900 million. And there was no wiggle room, there was no options. You had to take it, no questions. And but you know, when the Gallant government took over the books, there was no poison pills. And the reason why is that we showed prudence and we showed fiscal restraint. Nous avons fait preuve de prudence et de modération financière. Now, however, you see many of these projects, Memram Cook, Centennial Place, the Gunningsville Bridge, Route 11, they're being announced now, but the financial commitments go well beyond the next mandate. So, you know, and the plan for us to go back is now we'll have to manage those projects and we'll have to accept those poison pills that are started by this government, again, trying to find a place to invest, find a place to spend money, find a place where, but it's not just the next government that's going to have to deal with it, because they're making financial commitments for generation and generations to come. Tax, spend, spin. That's been the mantra of this government. Taxes totaling another $500 million per year from New Brunswickers, taking it out of their disposable income. Spending growth approaching 5% per year, plus hundreds of millions of infrastructure spending, and it's the spin, spin, spin. And they're justifying that by saying we are doing what New Brunswick told us they want us to do, because we listen to New Brunswickers. Well, Mr. Speaker, this government is saying we've gone out and consulted like never before, and what we are doing is what we're told to do by the New Brunswickers. Well, Mr. Speaker, this government is blaming the people and trying to justify their incompetence in managing a budget. That's what they're doing, is they're blaming the people of the province of New Brunswick for their inability to make and show fiscal responsibility. And again, I'm sure they could produce New Brunswickers that would support them in this, but Mr. Speaker, je ne suis pas la seule personne qui trouve ces budgets malheureux. Because they're certainly not listening to the seniors who told them to keep their hands off the assets. Seniors are still concerned that they're going to find a way to take their assets. Certainly not the people who are being forced to wait 2 years for surgery, as I mentioned in the letter that I read earlier. They're certainly not listening to the people who said it would be fiscally responsible to balance the budget now. The Gallant government is not listening to teachers, parents, or experts from all over the education spectrum who are saying, quit messing with the classroom. Sustainability is absolutely essential. The Gallant government did a 10-year plan, and then they threw it away and started making their own decisions for the classroom. So they're not listening to the teachers, they're not listening to the people who made the 10-year education plan. The Gallant government's not listening to young parents who say daycare is something that is a huge concern. You may recall the debate we had on changes to the daycare workers and owners the first year of the government mandate, where they took away funding from the private daycare owners, a policy decision that we disagreed with. But again, now you see money being spent in areas, and you have to ask the question, why were they not more inclusive in their funding? The threshold for daycare subsidy is still $55,000. And again, this government may argue that $55,000 is a substantial amount of money, but Mr. Speaker, in talking to people that two working parents making $55,000 with potentially 3 children, they're having a tough time making ends meet. But that threshold was not changed, and the program doesn't help the stay-at-home mums. Once again, that's a huge sacrifice, and it's a sacrifice that we applaud, to have the time and effort that people put into raising children. And we want this Gallant government to help, but we want to make sure that it's inclusive rather than exclusive. The Gallant government is also not listening to the recent grads and all the university students and families who were blindsided by the government's funding cuts for the post-secondary support. The Gallant government's not listening to our New Brunswick business people. The Gallant government's not listening to the Chamber of Commerce, the economic experts, who are saying that our economy is being crushed by the tax burden imposed by this government. The Gallant government is not listening to experts like Richard Sayon, who said that their choice to continue with deficits and growing debt is pushing the province further over the fiscal cliff. And again, this government is not listening to the Auditor General, time and time again. You remember the headlines, Mr. Speaker, and I'm sure the members here in the chamber do. Auditor General slams government accounting claims once again. Kim McPherson says province not following proper public sector accounting practices with contingency fund. And this contingency fund has been a topic that we found has been an issue that's used on a political manner and created a lot of the smoke around the budgets in the last 2 years, even up to this year, where that contingency fund is now taken out, and the Gallant government is saying that they're cutting the deficit in half. Well, Mr. Speaker, we know that with that contingency fund, the debt was inflated. The debt in the first year was inflated with the contingency fund, and not only that, they've actually taken an additional $5 million, but yet there's still a debt here in the province of New Brunswick. So that's some of the smoke and mirrors that we talk about. And Mr. Speaker, during estimates, the members and the critics are going to blow away the smoke, they're going to look behind the mirror, and they're going to find out the real truth on where this money is being spent to make sure it's being spent in a prudent manner for the people here in the province of New Brunswick. But going back to the comments of McPherson, said the contingency fund, which is used by the Gallant government to absorb overspending without, it does not adhere to professional financial reporting rules. She also said it will not be recognized by her in the province's upcoming audited financial statements. The infamous contingency fund came up yesterday, as I mentioned, in question period, as our leader tried to help the Premier find his way back to reality and factual, accurate statements. Of course, to no avail. Premier has become so addicted to spin that accuracy for him is like kryptonite to Superman. I'm sure they'll recognize that similarity. But this blame the taxpayer narrative is found in the finance minister's budget speech. It must be wearing thin in the province of New Brunswick. It's the same narrative that this government used after the SPR, Strategic Program Review charade. And then the government blamed the taxpayers for the HST hike. A former U.S. president is credited by saying you can fool all the people some of the time, some of the people all the time, but you can't fool all the people all of the time. Well, Mr. Speaker, we won't be fooled. The people in the province of New Brunswick won't be fooled. This Gallant government has taken New Brunswickers for fools too long, and it's got to stop. It'll stop next election. For sure. I'm not done. I'm not done. Thank you. Thank you very much. Here's another comment that was the Minister of Finance framed up, saying, New Brunswickers expect us to stick with the financial plan we laid out in last year's budget. Well, I have a little news for the Finance Minister and the Premier. The expectation that New Brunswickers now have of this government has been reduced to such a low point that it's probably non-existent. One thing the New Brunswickers are no longer expect from this government is accuracy, along with the factual information and reality. And we've seen that. We've had that debate here in the legislature. We had it when the Deputy Premier was asked about some of the questions under conflict of interest or confidentiality. And again, we heard it in the judicial argument about moving judges around, where conversations weren't phone calls, or phone calls weren't conversations, they were just meetings. And anyways, and we see the member from Dalhousie, Campbellton Dalhousie. The Minister of Alternative Facts, I guess, who was called out on CBC because of the many statements that he made that were incorrect. And Mr. Speaker, that was an interesting point in time where, you know, that was recorded, and certainly that's what happened when you start checking some of the comments that were made were not in fact the facts. So, Mr. Speaker, a lot of New Brunswick gave up on some of that accuracy during the Premier's second State of the Province speech last year. And it was certainly confirmed in the third State of the Province speech, where the Premier talked about a soaring economy, growth leader, 3,000 jobs online. And again, we question all of those statements, and we have the facts and numbers to prove that they're wrong. It was all fluff. They were not connected to reality. And the government's claim now that they're listening and getting things done is certainly falling on deaf ears. The people in the province of New Brunswick have had 29 months of straight spin, longer if you include the election cycle, and people know better. You know, Mr. Speaker, servicing the public debt in New Brunswick will reach over $700 million this year. It is becoming something that is a real concern. And again, it's not just me or the opposition saying this. Kirk Peacock wrote a very accurate and factual commentary in yesterday's Telegraph Journal, in which he contrasts the Gallant government with our closest neighbours, Mr. Peacock wrote, and I would suggest people read it, especially the members across the floor, because it does contain a significant amount of accuracy. Anyways, Mr. Peacock wrote, to underline the point that the present government has deliberately chosen its current path of consistently spending more than it takes in. Consider how New Brunswick's neighbours have fared during the same period. Prince Edward Island, Nova Scotia, and Quebec all have Liberal provincial governments, and they have essentially balanced their books, even as the New Brunswick government continues to bring out its own charge card. Anyways, it goes on, but it was very interesting. The Gallant government has chosen to continue running deficit. They have chosen to add $2.4 billion to the net debt, and that's climbing. It's approaching 14.4 and heading to 15 billion. Le gouvernement Gallant a choisi continuer d'accumuler de déficit. They've chosen to raise taxes by $500 million. They've chosen to blame the people and shun all responsibility for the actions. I will compliment the minister. The minister stayed on message very, very well. And I can tell the minister believes her own rhetoric. It's a great act. But when the minister says it's a balanced approach, it seems that the scales are tipped away from the taxpayers who have had to fork out an additional $500 million and counting to the government coffers, with no balanced budget in sight in this mandate and beyond. When the minister says we're investing, well, we know for sure that they're spending. That's for certain. But when somebody invests, there is an expected and measurable return on that investment. Paying for former political cronies or paying for ads that don't state the fact offer no return on investment, in my opinion. Now, listening to the people of New Brunswick may be part of the act and part of the speaking notes of the minister, but the actions of the government to deliver a budget that reflects the huge tax increases, huge spending, with no checks, no balance, it continues to plunge the province further and further into debt. And that is not what some taxpayers are saying. One final thought as I wrap up. No, I've been encouraged to put more. You know, again, the minister yesterday said that there were no new taxes. How shortly, they expect people to forget the increase in the HST and all the other 10 taxes that they raised. But you say no new taxes, but the way people are being taxed has changed and is changing. And we mentioned that earlier in the campground and the campers that now are going to have to pay more money. And, Mr. Speaker, the property tax bills will be out in the mailboxes of New Brunswick. And certainly the minister will have to listen at that point in time if, again, people are having to pay more and more and not getting additional services. We certainly look forward to the estimates, and the critics, again, will be asking some very, very difficult questions, but they want to try and stop the spin cycle, Mr. Speaker. They want to get the real facts and the details. And, Mr. Speaker, the minister, the premier, and their colleagues, they'll have to listen to the people in the next election. They'll have to listen to the people to say enough's enough. They'll have to say that we want somebody who is responsible in charge of the budget. And, Mr. Speaker, they'll have to listen to the people say that we want the member from Quispamsis to be the next person in charge. That's where we're going to